Okay, and let me pull everyone back. Where did they go? Sorry, we're not the most.
It's good to know this happens to you as well.
Where did
Joy.
everyone go?
Not just to us.
Where did everyone go? No, I mean their videos. Yeah. We were almost ready. Where did they show? I just minimized them to start recording and then they didn't come back. Oh, there they are. There they are. If you do them like that. Okay. Okay. And if you want to remind everyone to try and turn on their online participants can turn on their. Okay. Yeah. Over to Denise.
Okay, welcome everybody to this morning's parallel session. Can I just ask the people who are joining us online, we have two screens where we can see you. So if you would like to turn your cameras on, please feel free to do so. You're not obliged, but it would be quite nice for our speakers to be able, and us in the audience, to be able to see you as well. So I'd just like to introduce our first speaker this morning. This is Liz Molyneux from Edge Hill University, and she's going to talk to us about internationalisation of the curriculum. What does it mean for EAP? Over to you, Liz.
All right, thanks very much, Denise. Okay, so just a quick introduction, and then we'll get into the meat of what we're talking about today. So I've come from Edge Hill University. Maybe some people have not heard of that one, just one county over in Lancashire. Quite a non-internationalised university, I think that's probably fair to say. A very small number of international students. So it's sort of interesting for me sort of looking at internationalisation of the curriculum within the context of that sort of type of university. But a lot of my interest in this and my background really is born from teaching overseas for quite a number of years. I spent quite a long time in China, Vietnam, most recently Kazakhstan, with Matthew here in the audience. And there I was working in sort of a number of what you might call sort of international higher education situations. Started looking into, well, what does it mean, this idea of the sort of international university, internationalisation of higher education. It's spoken about a lot, maybe at the strategic level, but really sort of what does that mean more at the sort of the grassroots classroom level? What is it that we're sort of trying to achieve with this sort of internationalisation? So that's where my sort of interest and research in here began. So today I'll talk about some of the things that I've been thinking about in the context of internationalisation of the curriculum, and how that fits in with intercultural communication as well. Let's see if we can just move on to the next slide. Here we go. So we'll start off with a conceptual framework for internationalisation of the curriculum. Maybe this is one way to sort of conceptualise how to approach the process of internationalisation, looking at a number of different layers of context that we can consider within that. Given the audience and the nature of this conference, then we'll have a look at how this could apply within an EAP programme, and then broadening out at the end of this presentation as well to start looking at this idea of internationalisation for all. So to begin, then, what is internationalisation of the curriculum? We've got a definition here from Betty Leask, who literally sort of wrote the book on internationalising the curriculum here. She says it's the incorporation of sort of international, intercultural and global dimensions sort of into the curriculum. Couple of important things to note here in terms of her definition. She talks about internationalisation of the curriculum as a process, as being sort of ongoing activity and ongoing endeavour, very much context specific, and it's definitely not a product. If we're speaking about the internationalized curriculum, having this sort of finished product that then can be sort of rolled out and exported, that is precisely what she's trying to argue and advocate the opposite of doing here. Another thing to point out, I think, within this definition here, as well as her idea of the curriculum, I think often when we think of the curriculum, the first thing that comes to mind is the formal curriculum, maybe our syllabus content, what we say we're going to teach students, what they learn sort of in the classroom and what we assess. So this idea of the formal curriculum. But she's also talking about sort of internationalization in the sense of looking at the informal curriculum. So this might be perhaps student services or other things that are involved in the higher education experience on campus or otherwise, as well as the hidden curriculum as well. So this is maybe not explicit, in fact, maybe implicit, and the values, the messages that students receive about what's important, what's valued. Specifically in this context, we might be talking about whose language, whose values, whose knowledge is important and valued in the university context as well. So she's talking about sort of internationalization of the curriculum in this broad sense, not just this limited focus there on sort of syllabus content, although that is, of course, relevant and important as well. All right, so here's the framework which she recommends using here for this. So again, this sort of internationalization doesn't happen in this vacuum. This internationalization of higher education maybe being a response to this sort of globalization. She's saying we don't want this sort of globalized, homogenous form of higher education, of a curriculum basically just sort of transposed to different national contexts. But really looking at the global context, the region, the national, the local, the institutional, using that context to really sort of try and understand, well, how does that feed into our discipline, our knowledge, and then how does these layers of context sort of apply within a particular field and in a particular context there. Again, with our focus today being on EAP, that's what we'll focus on here. But really just a reminder that it takes in all of these other aspects, these other components as well. Okay, so well, what is the national or the international context for this? A lot of the writing about internationalization of higher education, or particularly these terms anyway, really started to gain ground in the sort of like the late 90s, the early 2000s. Sometimes I think that wasn't a long time ago, but then if we look back maybe to what the world was like in the early 2000s, then maybe it looks quite different to what it looked like now. Certainly in a lot of the literature on this, and perhaps at the time as well, we've got maybe more optimism with globalization and some of the promise there. If we contrast the Beijing Olympics from 2008, maybe with the Beijing Olympics 2022, so China's coming out ceremony to the world was sort of how it was marketed anyway in some forms, and then the recent Olympics, the environment certainly was quite different then. We've got these Millennium Development Goals, which have subsequently become the Sustainable Development Goals, idealistically thinking the change of the millennium, that by 2015 global hunger would be a thing of the past. Doesn't seem to have happened yet. And then, yeah, the introduction of the euro as well, this sort of greater sort of integration, cooperation, collaboration, ever closer unity within the European Union there as well. I won't go into too much detail about where we are now and let those images sort of speak for themselves. That's not particularly the topic for today, but suffice to say that maybe the global environment is looking somewhat different. Knight and DeWitt talk about this sort of current anti-global, anti-immigration, inward-looking political climate, perhaps the rise of nationalism we can see happening in some places. The internationalization project of higher education, maybe we've got less of an emphasis on collaboration. We've got more competition for student funding, for rankings, for status, sort of between universities. So this is the environment that perhaps we are operating in at the global level. I would make the argument there that maybe that this doesn't really undermine the internationalisation of the curriculum project, but perhaps rather underlies its importance, or perhaps gives it more of a sense of urgency that we really need to be looking at, well, what are universities doing in the classroom? What are the educational experiences of students? Why does this matter? What are our outcomes? And looking beyond perhaps just these competitive elements of internationalisation, which are quite apparent as well. So if we start to look then at the sort of institutional or the national context, then what is an internationalised curriculum for? We'll often see these two conceptualizations become quite apparent here. We've got this idea of the global worker. Universities or internationalized university is trying to produce a worker for the global labour market. They'll have these intercultural competencies, intercultural intelligence, that's to be able to interact, transact successfully across borders. Perhaps in opposition to that, we've got this idea of the global citizen, encompassing a lot of the same competencies, intercultural competencies there as the global worker. But a bit of a difference with the positionality there as well. You've got these competencies, but also maybe this orientation or this disposition to wanting to affect change. And so how do we change things at the global level? The importance is sort of understanding that link between the local and the global there as well. You could make the argument, I suppose, all political action is local political action. And then we have these effects at the higher level as well there. So are these in opposition or are they complementary? Difficult to say. Harrison looks at these perhaps as being sort of quite different concepts, but ultimately says, well, maybe the global citizen does need a global job. So we've got to take account of both of these. Leask, maybe a bit more provocatively, talks about this and says, well, the global citizen, that's about being human as well as being a productive worker. So perhaps we can build these concepts one on top of another as well. They don't necessarily have to be the either or. So which of those should be prioritized then sort of within a particular sort of institutional context or a national context? Well, here we need to, well, what is the documentation we can look at? What's the strategy? What's being advocated within the national context? And usually when we start to look into this, it's usually very easy to see that we've got these two sort of quite dominant conceptualizations making an appearance. I've got an example here from Advanced HE on their guidance on internationalisation here, very clear to identify, okay, which one is the global worker and which one is the global citizen. I would say fairly typically in this guidance document, then we have this global worker concept appears first or primary, and the global citizen appears at least second, perhaps secondary in importance, more often than not secondary in position and location within documentation anyway, if it appears. You will very often find this sort of employability narrative as well there. Why is this so? And looking again at sort of other factors that will influence the national context as well. Employability is quite measurable. If we're looking at things like graduate outcomes, university rankings, sort of employability, it's quite easy to quantify, it's quite easy to count, they lend themselves to metrics. So universities, if you've incentivized, we've got a metric, we can count it, then we can do it. How do we quantify, put a metric on the global citizen? Much harder. So even if it is there, then it doesn't necessarily receive as much attention if it doesn't feed into some of these rankings, some of these scales in the same way perhaps as employability metrics do. If we look again then to the institutional context, well, which of these concepts is apparent, which is there? There will be variety. I think however many different universities we've got here, everybody's sort of institutional focus might be somewhat different. But places to look, internationalisation strategy, you'll probably find things in there. Mission, vision, value statements from universities as well, graduate attributes. So looking at, well, what type of graduate is the university professing to produce? And then we can look at, okay, well, how are these things actually enacted within the curriculum as well? All right, so now that brings me to EAP. And I think Adrian Halliday has just done some of the hard work in terms of looking at, well, how we can understand some of these things and apply within the context here. So I'll try not to sort of repeat too much of what we've just heard this morning already. Within our field as EAP teachers, there's quite a lot of affordances, I think, for curriculum internationalisation. Often we have quite a lot of flexibility within terms of the content of the curriculum. Quite often we'll have skills focused curriculums, so we can pick and choose, okay, what's the content of the text, what are the case studies, what are the topics, what are the activities that we choose to do. So bringing in those international, intercultural, global dimensions into course content, quite often we've got quite a lot of flexibility there to do that. There's also quite a lot of national and cultural diversity within the student body. Adrian Holliday's already spoken about not conflating these two ideas of the national and the cultural, so he's done a very good job of that already, so I won't repeat. But we do have certainly a lot of diversity within the classrooms anyway, however much that may or may not be linked to passport. I think within the EAP as well, we do have this emphasis on developing good communication skills. Adrian already mentioned this morning, maybe this first iteration or the previous iteration of the presentation was based around building communication skills based on the communication skills that students have got and what they bring into the classroom. Depending on how we define good communication or good intercultural communication, there could be a certain amount of crossover there. If we've got these considerations, not only of, well, how is it that I encode within language my message and send that across, but thinking about communication more as this sort of successful interaction, successful negotiation of meaning. If we're understanding and teaching our students to be successful communicators in that sense, then there's a lot, I think, there for building in intercultural communication as well, necessarily, in order to be able to interact successfully, effectively, however we define that. Also, I think within our field, we've got quite a lot of emphasis on the development of group work skills. Group work is probably the most commonly sort of cited pedagogy for developing cross-cultural skills. So, okay, you know, we'll just put diverse students together in a group and then, you know, these intercultural skills will materialize. Turns out it's like not that simple. But I think within EAP as well, like a lot of our focus is, well, how do we build in effective group working skills for students to be able to work with others to achieve something. And again, that's, as has already been said this morning, is maybe a difficulty that many students will have. It doesn't really matter what sort of national identity they're bringing in there with the classroom. But if we're not just putting students in groups, we're actually encouraging working, scaffolding, encouraging reflection for students to be effective sort of team workers, participating. I think this is something we do and can do within EAP curriculums anyway. And another thing also shouldn't be left out or forgotten about here is the intercultural or international orientations of a lot of the teaching faculty that we work with. A lot of people will have had experience overseas and will be bi or trilingual as well. So these are all maybe resources within our departments that we have to draw on too. But there are some possible tensions here, and this is where things start to get a little bit tricky. Here we've got some of the tenets of internationalisation of the curriculum there. We need to be really careful not to, if we're promoting English language proficiency, maybe yes, as English language teachers, we should be helping students with their language. But how do we avoid this English language hegemony there as well? Perhaps sort of less visible and less written about these maybe related concepts here. Well, if we're promoting a particular epistemology in the classroom, okay, this is the way you show that you know something. This is the way knowledge is constructed as an absolute. Well, what does that mean in terms of recognition and enabling students to develop different epistemologies? Again, already discussed to some extent this morning. And also as well, this idea of assimilation here. Lewis talks about this idea of false consciousness of immigrant students during their experiences of integration into higher education institutes, even though they might have these preferences and expectations of acculturation. What she's found has actually happened is that we do have a lot more of this sort of assimilation of the minority culture into the majority. Is that what happens in EAP? Is that what happens with the students that we deal with when we come in here? I think these are things that we need to start thinking about. I've got very little time left, so I will just sort of wrap up quickly here. Again, already addressed somewhat this morning. I've been talking about EAP students. The assumption is we're dealing with international students here. Is internationalisation something only for international students? Well, we've got this guidance document here from the HEA saying here, well, internationalising the curriculum is part of the Teaching International Students project. So this sort of highly suggests that, yes, this is just for international students here. Seems a bit strange that international students somehow are the ones lacking these language skills, these sort of multicultural or multi-language skills here. The international students coming in to campus in the UK are lacking these sort of international perspectives. So this internationalisation is something to happen for the benefit of international students. Seems a bit odd. In fairness to the HEA, their position has somewhat changed since then. So the point here really is not to vilify the HEA for sort of these statements some time ago, more just to recognise that these narratives have been prevalent, have been dominant, and perhaps there's still a legacy effect of that now as well. So then we come into this territory more of internationalisation of the curriculum at home. Internationalisation then being this endeavour really for all students needing all these intercultural perspectives, intercultural skills, international perspectives as well. So moving away from this sort of separating home students and international students there too. So HEA as well, and the more recent guidance documents in this area make that explicit point there now as well, that we're not having a separation here. Really the idea of this internationalising higher education is this global learning for the whole cohort of students. So how can EAP support this idea? Well, hopefully there's lots of people talking about this today. Working across departments with different disciplinary faculties. I know Matthew's talking about some of that later today as well. Working with language centres where I am within Edge Hill. The EAP and the English language side of things is housed in a department with the foreign languages side. So opportunities there, I think, perhaps. Also representation on institutional committees, internationalisation committees, making sure that the learning and teaching agenda is recognised within that internationalisation committee, and equally in the teaching and learning committee, making sure that internationalisation has some representation as well there. So perhaps within the EAP community, we're quite well positioned to be sort of bridging those two gaps there. Okay, so that's basically the end of my presentation there. I sort of began with a question, and frustratingly, I'm going to finish with questions as well. I promise that's not because I'm shying away from giving answers, but that really is to reiterate Leask's point from the beginning, that there isn't this sort of one size fits all approach. I can't tell you what an internationalized curriculum looks like for you. I can tell you these are perhaps some of the things that you could think about when you're working on this process in a way which is suitable in your department, in your context as well. Okay, so that brings me to the end. I think I've got just about gone to the 5 minutes mark. So we do have, I think, a couple of minutes perhaps for questions or comments or answers to the questions as well. More than happy to hear how you might be thinking about responding to those two. So over to you.
You might like to start by inviting some of our online participants if they have any questions. I can't see any coming up in the chat, but they might just want to raise their hand and ask a question.
We do have a hand up from Eva. Eva, are you there? Can you unmute yourself and speak?
Hiya. I don't
Hello.
know. I've got different screens here and I can't see myself. So hi. Thank you. That was very interesting and really topical for the situation we're in at the University of Chester as well. It wasn't really a question. I was just applauding, actually. But I think that this tallies with the whole idea of the interdisciplinary approach that we really need at the moment to understand what each different part of our institutions are doing and link it up and move away from this idea of international students as just a sort of supreme funding source. And that's all I wanted to say, so thank you very much.
Yeah, no, can totally agree with you there, Eva, as well. And again, I think going back to maybe some of the drivers for internationalisation, I think call it the cynic or the realist in me, whichever one you want. There are certainly financial motivations for internationalising, but what is the educational rationale for this as well? Is that getting the attention that it deserves? Is internationalised education living up to its purported values? So what do we do at the curriculum level so sort of, as educators as well to counterbalance or make the most of at least maybe those financial realities that we're in here as well.
Just thinking about how to phrase this, but do you think that internationalization of the curriculum is, so to speak, maybe mutually beneficial both to the university and to the students? Because obviously higher education institutes can make a lot of money from having increased international students. Obviously the students are getting an education, but when it comes to this idea of being a global worker, how many opportunities do students really have to do that? And do we need external players like outside of the university to kind of get in on this somehow to kind of make that more possible?
So how can universities sort of fulfill this purported aim of creating the global worker, and is that something that the university alone can do? Yeah, I mean, certainly I think if we're looking at sort of employability sort of narratives and strategies, if we leave aside the international for the moment, then yeah, closer and closer relationships with employers through work experience and these sort of things are important. And understanding, well, what is it that employers say that they want, and what is it that like universities are actually sort of producing. So yeah, is that something just for the university to define? No, probably not. But again, working with alumni students and that as well to see, okay, well, what do they think they want from the university compared to, well, you know, a few years later, not just for the first year in terms of getting into the job, but how does university sort of prepare a student for a fulfilling and engaging career in the long term, rather than just that first step on the ladder? I think gets quite interesting. Yeah, is it mutually beneficial? I think that endeavour of, is an internationalised higher education mutually beneficial? So what do UK universities get from, say, importing international students? I think certainly, as was a few years ago, I don't know how it's been affected by the pandemic, but education was one of the biggest exports of the UK. So the UK benefits from this. UK universities sort of benefit financially. How do the students benefit? They get this certificate at the end of it that says that, you know, they're from this recognised university, but then if that's all, that's again, I think feeding into this commodification of higher education, where you're just getting the certificate and the certificate is then the passport to the job, regardless of what you learn. So I think these commodification trends are troubling. So you can see the internationalization of the curriculum maybe as a response to that. So it's not just this giving of the certificate because we've got this export of education, but what is the actual education experience? What are we trying to produce within this education, given that we've got maybe a lot of these inflows of students? What does that mean at the curriculum level? And I think that's the questions maybe that we need to address, so that we're avoiding maybe some of the worst manifestations of that commodification.
Well, basically, this is a very general question at my end.
Can I just interrupt? We're just about closing time, so is it a quick, if you make it a really quick question?
It's a yes or no question, I'll answer.
It might turn out to be a very open-ended question, so you know, but we
Better
will
off
probably
doing
just
it
give it, yeah.
afterwards in the room.
Yeah.
Right, maybe.
Coffee soon.
So just want to say thank you very much to Liz. That was fascinating. You could continue your discussions in refreshments, which is in LG 10, where we were this morning. And thanks very much, everybody. Thanks for your participation.
Thank you. Thank you.
If you want to recall
Yes, I will stop recording. There was one question that came in. But let me just. I'll edit it.